In this lecture, we'll talk about various efforts to measure internet censorship. First, let's talk about why it's interesting or important to measure internet censorship in the first place. There are many reasons that we may wish to measure internet censorship. One of them includes the desire to design tools to circumvent censorship. And in a future week, we'll discuss various circumvention tools and how they exploit knowledge about how censorship occurs to design circumvention tools. But another reason that we may wish to measure censorship is purely to understand the state of the world or the state of internet censorship better. In particular, in this class, we have seen some theories and observations from political scientists on a smaller scale. And in particular, this domain is quite interested in knowing more about the state of internet censorship so that we can better understand how various regimes might use internet censorship to control online speech. One of the facets of interest is whether we can establish variation within an authoritarian regime, across countries, across regions within a particular country, and even across time, for example, on certain calendar days. Another aspect which might trigger variation are political movements in neighboring countries. And that's another area that is of great interest in political science. Ultimately, we're also interested in explaining internet censorship, what the ultimate intentions are, the reasons, whether the reasons are cultural, political, social, or otherwise, whether we can tie descriptions of a particular regime to the methods that are practiced in that particular country. So whether, for example, capitalist states or authoritarian states or certain types of democracies practice certain forms of censorship, where other types of governments practice other types of censorship, remains an interesting open question. Also, understanding why and when we observe these shifts, and whether a state or government ever has an incentive to decrease censorship, remains an interesting and open issue. It's also interesting to ask whether the methods that we know about and that we can measure are used as complements. For example, one type of manipulation being used in conjunction with another, or whether the methods are substitutes, where one particular method might be used in place of another method. Another aspect of interest is to explore and understand how technology for censoring or limiting speech or controlling online discourse diffuses from one country to another. Political scientists sometimes talk about China, for example, as the thought leader in repression of online speech, and it has certainly been the case in the past that we can observe the practices in certain countries as a precursor or a foreshadowing of the types of techniques and technologies that will ultimately be deployed more broadly. There are a wide variety of types of internet filtering that we can measure. We can measure the filtering or manipulation of the domain name system through inconsistent responses or blocked responses. We can measure TCP/IP filtering. We can measure the web filtering. And we can also measure the effectiveness or lack thereof of various circumvention tools, including virtual private networks, Tor, and other types of circumvention tools. When we consider the types of filtering that could occur as a user attempts to access a website, there are many possible mechanisms for censorship that we have observed. We've talked about many different types of censorship that are possible via censorship of the domain, the IP address, or the URL itself. And within those categories, there are different ways of filtering or manipulating the responses. And so a holistic suite of censorship measurement should be able to capture all these different variations or combinations thereof. Various large-scale efforts are underway to better understand censorship on a global scale through large-scale measurement. The Google Transparency Report is one such effort. It uses traffic destined to Google services and fluctuations or variations in those traffic patterns to understand where disruption or manipulation may be occurring based on the fluctuations observed to Google services. These measurements are, of course, specific to disruption of Google services, but they are nonetheless an important bellwether for understanding whether or not more general or broader forms of manipulation may be occurring. Another tool is the Open Observatory of Network Interference, which is run from a client device and can perform a whole suite of tests, which we can see enumerated here. Performing censorship measurement from a client, such as a laptop or smartphone, is an effective way of testing the network. But it has one critical drawback, which is that one needs to recruit or somehow obtain participants to install the software and conduct the measurements. Doing so poses both recruitment challenges as well as potential ethical challenges if volunteers are asked to run censorship measurements from within a country. Here we can see a case study of how both of these tools yields information about disruptions to the network in the Uganda elections from January 2021. On the left side, we see dips in traffic to Google services from the period of about January 14th through January 18th. And similarly, we can see the tests from UNI on the right side that show disruptions to specific services from particular ISPs during the same period of time. It's of course interesting and helpful that these sets of measurements do corroborate one another. Censorship measurement is an imperfect process. Measurement at scale is always challenging, even if we're just talking about performance or reliability. But gathering measurements from locations where censorship is occurring is even more challenging. It's possible to measure filtering, blocking, or manipulation directly with certain tools. The Tor project's Open Observatory of Network Interference, UNI, is one leading tool that allows a client to measure these types of interference from a client device. And in subsequent parts of this module, we will explore other types of techniques. But an important drawback of UNI is that it requires a client to install the software and conduct the measurements essentially on demand. And gathering those types of measurements at scale can be challenging. And so in subsequent parts of this module, we'll explore a variety of other techniques that allow these kinds of measurements to be conducted indirectly or remotely.